Early Yu-Gi-Oh! Had a whole bunch of really weird card text, as a lot of cards were trying to explain mechanics of the game in their card text in addition to what the cards actually did. So in this list, we'll be going over cards which have some really weird wording for their rulings or just used to do something completely different. And at number 10, we have Lord of D. The original text of this card used to read, all dragon-type monsters are not affected by magic cards, trap cards, or other effects while this card is face up on the field. Which means the original version of this card used to grant all of your dragon monsters protection from basically all card effects, which was actually pretty powerful. They quickly errated the card though, in order to change it to the wording of all dragon-type monsters cannot be targeted by magic cards, trap cards, or other effects that specifically designate a target while this card's face up on the field. So it was basically changed from all dragons being unaffected by card effects to all dragons not being able to be targeted by card effects. Here's the thing though, early Yu-Gi-Oh! Rarely designated if a card targeted or not. If we take a look at the original tribute to the Doomed, for example, its first card text simply says, discard one card from your hand to the graveyard to destroy one monster card on the field, regardless of its position. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh! A card with this kind of card text would mean that the card does not target, since it doesn't specifically say that it does. So, it would be considered non-targeting removal. However, this card does target. In later erratas, it was changed that it selects the monster on the field, before eventually getting the card text where it says that it targets a monster on the field and destroys it. Or if we look at Raikou the Lightsworn Hunter, its original effect read that it can destroy one card on the field, then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. However, it was intended for the card to target, so its later printing said that it would select and then eventually target. However, it was eventually errated to no longer target, which makes things even more confusing with what cards can and can't target. So because a lot of early cards which did target didn't actually say they targeted, Lord of D wasn't super useful until problem-solving card text was added many years later, where it's still kinda difficult to determine if a card can target or not. And at number 9, we have Monster Reborn. The original card text for this card reads, select one monster card from either your opponent's or your own graveyard and place it on your field under your control in attack or defense position face up. This is considered a special summon. That's a lot of text to say special summon one monster from either player's graveyard, which is essentially what the modern version of Monster Reborn looks like. The reason Monster Reborn had so much text to explain such a simple mechanic was mainly to remind players what the special summon mechanic was, as Monster Reborn was one of the only cards in the game at the time that could actually special summon a monster, and it was a pretty iconic card that a lot of people were going to use, so I guess it made sense to explain that you can put the monster in either attack or defense position face up. And at number 8, we have Dust Tornado. The original card text for this card reads, destroy one magic or trap card on your opponent's side of the field. You can then set one magic or trap card from your hand. This card can only be activated if it is a quick play magic card. Now, besides the fact that this card doesn't specify that it targets, and the fact that it refers to spell cards as magic cards before they change the name of them, what you may have noticed about this card is that last line of text on it, where it says, the card it sets can only be activated if it's a quick play magic card. You see, in the very early Yu-Gi-Oh, quick play spell cards were usable the turn they were set, because they didn't have the ruling yet that basically treated them as trap cards. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh, if you set a quick play spell card from your hand face down, you're not allowed to use it during the same turn that it's set face down. However, before they updated the rulings on this, you were able to activate any spell card the turn they were put on the field, no matter what kind of card they were, including quick play spell cards. Because currently, if you set a normal spell card face down, you can then activate it during the same turn if you want. And the same case is true for every other type of spell card, except for quick play spell cards, so it definitely made sense for the original quick play spells to work like all other spell cards do. Although this was probably changed because of Dust Tornado, where you could use it to destroy one of your opponent's back row cards, then you could set it MST from your hand during your opponent's turn in order to destroy another card, so you only had to have one face down card in the field instead of 2 in order to achieve 2 back row pops. And at number 7, we have Wall of Illusion. This is a card that a lot of old school players know very well, as it was included in one of the original structure decks in the very first set in the TCG, and was actually good, because of its ability to bounce cards upon being attacked while having a pretty high defense. And the original card text of this card read, the monster attacking this creature is returned to its owner's hand, any damage resulting from the attack is calculated normally. Now, the wording on this probably doesn't seem that odd, when compared to something as wordy as the original Monster Reborn. Although, did you see the mention of the word creature rather than monster? You see, there are 3 types of cards in the game, that being monster cards, spell cards, and trap cards, but there are no creature cards. So the original text of Wall of Illusion refers to itself as a type of card that didn't exist in the game, although it was pretty obvious to guess that it meant monsters, so I'm sure all of nobody was actually confused. However, it is kind of funny that it referred to monsters as creatures, because a lot of other card games at the time, it did refer to their monsters as creatures, so it was probably just a convention of card games at the time, and how loose they were with the wording of all the effects of monsters in the time period, where they weren't as strict in the wording as they are today. And at number 6, we have Necrovalley. Necrovalley is kind of infamous for its number of erratas and changes to its card's actual effect over the years, so the original wording of this card is quite the treat, where its original card text is as follows. As long as this card remains face up on the field, all effects of magic, trap, and or effect monster cards that involve graveyards are negated, and neither player can remove cards in the graveyard from play. In addition, increase the attack and defense of all monsters that includes Gravekeepers in the name by 500 points. Now, the wording on this card seems like it probably makes practical sense. If you're trying to use cards like Premature Burial or Call of the Haunted, Necrovalley negates those cards' effects since they involve the graveyard so thoroughly. However, what exactly denotes a card that involves the graveyards? If you use Pot of Greed to draw 2 cards, you eventually send Pot of Greed to the graveyard afterwards. Does that mean it involves the graveyard? Foolish Burial only sends a monster from your deck to the graveyard. Is that negated because it involves the graveyard? Now, it may seem as if I'm being pedantic, but these were some real ruling questions that involved Necrovalley because its wording was so vague. You could even argue that Maniac or Bug was negated because it destroys monsters, which go to the graveyard. So in order for Konami to try to make less ruling nightmares with Necrovalley's first printing of the effect, they went ahead and tried to fix it 7 other times before it eventually ended on the effect where cards in the graveyard cannot be banished, it negates any card effect that would move a card in the graveyard to a different place, and negates any card effects that change the types or attributes in the graveyard. So the modern version of Necrovalley is much more specific in what it actually stops, and is actually a pretty good field spell card because of how graveyard-centric a lot of decks are. And at number 5, we have Gravedigger Ghoul. The original card text for this was, select 2 monster cards from your opponent's graveyard. These monster cards are removed from play for the remainder of the duel. So basically what this card does is banish 2 cards from your opponent's graveyard. However, this was before banished was a codified keyword, one of the few keywords that actually exist in Yu-Gi-Oh, and before there were concrete rules on what you could do with cards that were removed from play. So this is another one of those cards which has reminder text on it, trying to tell you what the card does, where it's explaining the concept of removing cards from your opponent's graveyard from play. However, it goes on to say that they're removed from play for the remainder of the duel, which could imply they're not allowed to get those cards back. Even in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, they had cards like Primal Seed, which allowed you to recover banished cards. Although Primal Seed wouldn't come out until 2 years after Gravedigger Ghoul, so in the very early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, a card removed from play really was removed from the game until the end of the duel, because there wasn't really a way to interact with removed from play cards yet. Once they started printing more cards that interacted with banished cards, Gravedigger Ghoul received an errata, which just removed that last line of text that said they were removed from play until the end of the duel. And at number 4, we have Mask of Restrict. This is a continuous trap card which has a floodgate effect that had the original text of, no matter the situation, neither player can offer any monsters as a tribute. Now, the obvious intended use of this card is to make it so monsters can't be tribute summoned, nor be tributed by card effects like that of Cannon Soldier. However, the wording of this card is incredibly extreme, almost as if it's yelling at you that, no matter the situation, you're not allowed to tribute monsters. Like, for example, say you're at an event, your opponent has a Master Restrict out, someone comes up and threatens you to spill water all over your cards. Unless you tribute a monster, you wouldn't be able to tribute anything because Master Restrict has the effect where it says, no matter the situation, you're not allowed to offer any monsters as tribute. Eventually, the card did get some changes in order to give it card text which was no longer as extreme on the conditions of tributing, where it was changed to just neither player can tribute any monsters under any conditions, then to monsters cannot be tributed, changed again to cards cannot be tributed, before finally being changed to neither player can tribute cards. And at number 3, we have Pot of Greed. For this part of the list, we're going to be looking over its original Japanese text, where the original text of this card reads, when translated to English, pull 2 cards from your deck, destroy Pot of Greed after it is played. Now, you may have noticed something odd about this card's text, besides the very confusing nature of what it actually does. You see, when Yu-Gi-Oh was very first released, there were still a couple of rules that were being worked out with how spells and traps would function, and one of those rules was how cards would be sent to the graveyard after they were used. One of the first ideas they had was that every spell and trap card would just stay on the field forever unless the card specifically designated that it would go to the graveyard afterwards, which is why Pot of Greed has the extra effect where it destroys itself after its play. That way it doesn't stay on the field forever. And if you've ever wondered why Swords of Revealing Light, a card which stays on the field for 3 turns, is a normal spell card and not a continuous spell card, it's because that card is a holdover from the original ruling, where all cards are just on the field forever until the conditions for how they would leave the field were met. And in Swords of Revealing Light's case, it was after 3 turns had passed. And since Pot of Greed was meant to only be used a single time, it would destroy itself immediately after it was played. Eventually, after they changed the rulings, the next text of Pot of Greed was simply to draw 2 cards from your deck. And that's kind of how it stayed ever since, with the most modern version of it simply saying draw 2 cards. And at number 2, we have the 5-headed dragon. This is a fusion monster which in its original version didn't actually have its fusion materials listed on it like other fusion monsters, and instead had its fusion materials listed in its card effect, as well as a whole bunch of other weird stuff on it. The original text reads, "The fusion materials for this card are any 5 dragon type monsters. This monster cannot be special summoned except by fusion summon. This card does not take any battle damage and cannot be destroyed by battle with an earth, water, fire, wind, or dark monster. Battle damage is still inflicted to players." So its effect states what its fusion materials are, which would later be changed just to have 5 dragon type monsters as its fusion materials and removing that line of text. However, the interesting thing about this card is that line of text which reads, "This card does not take any battle damage," which is pretty superfluous because monsters can't take battle damage. Battle damage is something that's done to players, not monsters, so obviously this card doesn't take any battle damage. There's no reason for it to have that line of text at all. It also has the effect where it can't be destroyed by certain attributes of monsters, and then has reminder text that says battle damage is still inflicted to players. Now, I've heard some theories about why this card text probably had its text like this, which is probably explained if we look over the original wording of Waboku. The original text for Waboku is, "Any damage inflicted by an opponent's monster is decreased to 0 during the turn this card is activated." You see how this one also describes monsters as taking damage when that's not a mechanic in Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, the actual effect of this card is that you don't take any battle damage during the turn you use it, and also your monsters can't be destroyed by battle. However, you wouldn't know that unless you looked at the rulings on this card, because the actual text of the card doesn't really explain what the card is supposed to do. And you see, the theory behind the text on these 2 cards is that in other card games at the time, it was common for monsters to have health point values, where when those health values dropped to 0, they would be destroyed. So if you think of Yu-Gi-Oh monsters as having health point values, and the intended effects of both Waboku and 5-headed dragon is protecting them from being destroyed by battle, it makes sense why these 2 cards mentioned they don't take any battle damage, and why they thought wording the original Waboku in this way would be enough to obviously state that it protects monsters from being destroyed by battle, because if your monsters take no battle damage, then they can't be reduced to 0 hit points. Of course, Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't work that way at all, so in future printings of both of these cards, they removed any mentions of monsters taking battle damage, and instead properly just said they can't be destroyed by battle. And at number 1, we have the original text for Polymerization. The first text for this card was, "Fuses 2 or more fusion material monsters to form a new fusion monster." Now, what's interesting about this card is that it doesn't actually explain to you what it does. It reads more like a vanilla monster flavor text than an actual card effect. Because what does it mean to even fuse 2 monsters into a fusion monster? Do you put those monsters on top of themselves like future Xyz monsters? Can you use monsters from your deck? Do they go back to the deck, the graveyard? Well, the reason Polymerization didn't really explain what it did was because there was a ruling in the official rulebook, which had a whole page dedicated to it, explaining how fusion monsters worked. And since the process of fusion summoning was explained in the rulebook, and could only be done with Polymerization, I guess they assumed they didn't actually need to re-explain it on the Polymerization spell card itself. It used to be Polymerization was the only way to go into fusion monsters, so obviously they didn't need to explain how the card worked, because you had to set up your fusion deck with your fusion monsters before the duel began anyway. And if you went through the effort of doing that, you wouldn't really need the reminder text on Polymerization, since it was just an official ruling. However, in the second printing of the card, they actually gave the card a real effect, which explained how fusion summoning worked, where you'd send the monsters from your hand or your side of the field to the graveyard, which are listed as fusion materials on a fusion monster from your fusion deck. And I also read online that another reason they probably left Polymerization without any actual effect was because they weren't 100% sure how fusion summoning would work yet, as the original rulebook required you to have the monsters on your side of the field and didn't allow you to use monsters from your hand. So when they updated the rules, they didn't have to update the card because it never actually explained how it worked. And in fact, there is even a ruling that stated you could only fusion summon with Polymerization, which they eventually changed, but remnants of that old rule still exist in a lot of fusion monsters that can bring themselves out with alternative methods, where they all have extra text that says you do not have to use Polymerization. Alright, and that's the list. Do you know of any other old school cards that have weird text? If so, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments for a potential part 2 on this video.